Look, I'm slightly overcooking it, I suppose, because it's not life and death. I didn't want necessarily to do something that I thought would be very easy. I thrive in that kind of environment, and I do really enjoy it.
Hey, I've got a printer.
Yeah, exactly. It was such a rewarding experience.
So wholesome. I love it.
Today on the File Notes podcast, we're joined by Jordan Cole, Operations Director at MinterEllisonRuddWatts. Jordan is an incredible communicator and meticulous planner with an expertise in the behind the scenes of a law firm. In today's episode, we'll discuss Jordan's career journey leading him to his current role at MinterEllison, how to navigate obstacles and setbacks during projects, and why those early on in their career can take the pressure off. Thanks for joining us.
It seems like the whole universe has conspired against us recording this podcast episode. So thanks so much for joining us, Jordan. We've known each other for a good while now, and yeah, really excited for today's episode. Cool. So just 10 years into your career, you're the Director of Operations at MinterEllisonRuddWatts. Can you tell us a little bit about Minters and define what operation means for a large law firm?
Yeah, so Minters is a Tier 1 national law firm, and with offices in Auckland and Wellington. We've got 47 partners, and just like the other large law firms, practice in a range of sort of commercial law practice areas. That's managed by a management team and the partnership. What operations looks like in a law firm, I think that differs law firm to a degree. A lot of it is sort of structural in some senses, I think. So for me, I think the way to summarize it is probably variety, and that's something that I personally really enjoy in my day job, which is that no 2 days are generally the same. So I manage a few teams in Auckland and Wellington in the sort of office management space, but also litigation support, one of our fee earning teams, and our client services teams as well. So that is sort of from the people management side of things, I guess, and then there's the component of the other stuff that keeps me busy, I guess. So we're moving premises in Wellington at the moment, so I'm here at the moment. And that's keeping me quite busy. And so I look after the firm's premises and manage that with our landlords in Auckland and Wellington. Look after the firm's business continuity. I'm heavily involved in our sustainability and ESG program. Really, I think if it doesn't have a natural fit with finance, HR, IT, business development, it generally sits in my camp. And so I think that brings with it that variety. And yeah, I think I just really enjoy the variety of it, working with our partners and board on a range of things.
Yeah, interesting. And, on the topic of challenges, of course, yesterday we were intending to record this episode, and then Optus suffered the worst outage in Australian telecommunications history, and so I wasn't able to really talk to anyone. And then this morning we had some issues with Riverside, although, I use Optus, I like them, and I like Riverside too, but technical issues aside, it sounds like you've probably got one of the most diverse roles in probably a law firm where you're across so many different areas. What are some of the challenges associated with context switching across all of those different areas?
I think the pace can sometimes be a bit of a challenge in terms of you might be working on something for an hour or two and it's extremely critical and urgent, and then you just need to switch to something else because someone has let you know that the fridge is broken. So, so I've got to let our facilities team know that the fridge is broken. So sometimes that sort of, when you're dealing in a fast-paced environment, often law firms are, and you're trying to find a solution to something, and sometimes those little smaller kind of curveballs get thrown into the mix. I think that prioritization can sometimes be a little bit of a challenge. But again, I thrive in that kind of environment. I do really enjoy it. I think for me, when I reflect on our COVID era, which I was heavily involved in terms of managing our firm's response, along with others in the firm, that was a real challenge because, but for the obvious, but in terms of the intensity of work around planning for our workforce of 350 to work from home at the drop of a hat. And luckily we got very good at it, as most businesses did, and so we could adapt quite quickly. But particularly around all of the vaccination era and working with partners on our policies, it was a very busy period. And so I think for me, a lot of that time was effectively full-time on COVID with bits and pieces on the side. And when I think back, it's like, geez, what did I do that took a full-time job almost? What was I doing almost full-time during that period? But it genuinely was when I think back. And so, it was very hard to decompress, I think, after that. Even on a particular day, you might be doing something and then needing to switch to a business as usual type activity or task. And that was often quite a challenge for me.
That's really interesting. And I wonder, you mentioned prioritization there. I imagine when all these tasks are coming at you at a fast pace, a lot of the prioritization is kind of intuitive. You don't really think about it. But if you were to sit back and, look at your work and prioritize it really thoughtfully, what kind of process and what thought process would you go through to do so?
I think what would the impact of this be on our clients, I think, would be the first thing I would think of. And I look at clients a little bit differently than probably what our lawyers do and what our partners do, in the sense that, yes, our clients are absolutely the clients that we're providing legal services to. But being a non-lawyer in a law firm, I look at our client base as being our lawyers, because at the end of the day, my view on this is that non-lawyers and law firms are there to make the lives easier of our lawyers, so that ultimately they can be freed up to provide exceptional legal services to our clients in a very competitive legal market in New Zealand. So when I think about prioritising something, I think about the impact on the business, about what if I do this first or don't do this first. And look, I'm slightly overcooking it, I suppose, because it's not life and death what I deal in day to day. But I do often think what the impact would be on a client, whether it's a paying client in the market, depending on the nature of the task that I'm doing, or what would the impact be on partnership or this particular legal team or so on. So at the moment, as I said earlier, I'm heavily involved in our premises project. That's taking up effectively all of my day at the moment, and will do until we move in about May next year. So for me, that's kind of how I do it, and I've got a fantastic team behind me as well, and so sort of spreading that work out as much as possible.
Awesome. I'm really keen to talk about the premises work and also the kind of COVID-19 response maybe a little bit later. But for now, I'd love to kind of go back to before you started your career in law. So you were at the university in Auckland, you're studying toward an undergrad degree. What were you studying, and did you have like a particular career in mind?
I did. So I left school being very confident that I was going to be an accountant. I was actually quite good at accounting at school. So I started at the University of Auckland to study a BCom in accounting. And realised in the first year that actually it was very different to school, and I absolutely hated it. No offence to all the accountants out there, but it just wasn't for me. And so, obviously you have to do a range of compulsory papers in your first year of a business degree, and accounting was one of them. And so I switched majors. I actually can't remember now what I switched to at the time. And then partway through my second, I decided that I'd actually had enough, but I was too deep in to kind of throw it in, and I didn't want to throw it in, but I just felt as though I needed to change. And there were some things going on sort of personally at the time that meant that I couldn't quite dedicate 100% of my mental capacity to studying. And look, I was probably a bit of a crap student at university, to be fair. I think I was one of those students that I got okay marks in the first couple of years. I did quite well at school, so I thought that would translate automatically into university, but as we know, that's not the case. And with a bar on site at university, you get quite distracted, well, at least I did. And so that, coupled with kind of some things going on personally, I thought, well, let's just hit pause on this and reflect on what it is that I actually want to do long term, because at this point I wasn't quite sure. I knew I wanted to do something in the corporate world, but wasn't quite sure what that looked like. And so I was just working part-time at a supermarket at the time, just putting myself through uni, as most people do. And so I picked up a few extra hours there for the short term, and a role came up, I think in sort of the print room, mailroom type role at another law firm, Meredith Connell. And so I started there in 2012. And the plan was for me to kind of do a year and then go back to studies. 8 years later, I was still there, but I did finish my studies. In my defence, I did study part-time, and Meredith Connell supported me very well through that period.
Yeah, and I know that between university and joining Meredith Connell, you also considered potentially like a career in the police.
Yes. Yeah.
But of course today you're not in uniform.
No.
You didn't become a police officer. I wonder, like, a lot of people go through that process of, I don't know what I want to do in life, and answering that question. What advice would you have for young people trying to like figure out what they want to do?
I think there's so much pressure at school. Well, at least I can only talk from my experience, of course, but I felt at the time, and certainly looking back, that there was a lot of pressure at school that by the time you finish, you have to have it figured out. So you have to say, I'm going to university, I'm going to study X, Y, Z, or I'm going to learn a trade, or I'm going to work at this place and work up the ranks. And so looking back, I had also fell into that pressure, I think. And if someone told me at high school that I would be doing what I'm doing now, I wouldn't really have thought that would be the case. And sometimes I do think how I ended up in this role and doing what I'm doing, just generally, because it's not really an intuitive role that you grow up at school and think, I'm going to work in a law firm in legal, in operation. It's not quite seen as something that is a common role. So for me, I think that it's just that inherent pressure at school to have it figured out by the time you leave, and I do think that contributes in large part to people when they get to university. In particular, they kind of don't have it all figured out, and some degrees are much better than others in terms of flexibility of changing majors on the way through, and a BCom at Auckland is one of those, but not all of them are. Particularly law, for example, once you're in, you're in. And so, I would say that it's that kind of pressure that starts to build up at school. And I remember actually attending our kind of school year leavers dinner with the teachers and parents come along, and your year level are there, and your name gets called, and you go up, shake the hand of your dean and get your certificate or whatever, and sit back down. And in that process, when they introduce you to come up and get your certificate or whatever it was, they tell everybody what it is that you're off to do. And I would love to figure out somehow how, whether we're all doing what we said we were going to be doing all those years ago, because I guarantee we aren't. And I think that's a good thing. I think, people can figure it out and along the way, and generally you kind of land on your feet and I think everything happens for a reason.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I think it's really interesting. In our last episode, we were talking with Hayden Wilson from Denton's Kensington Swan, and a point that he raised was that actually we often think about law school as this place where we train lawyers how to practice law, but in fact, so many law graduates go on to careers in other fields, and the same is true for many other disciplines. And so I think to your point, like a lot of the pressure and stress that comes from trying to decide what you want to do in the future is thinking about a lot of your decisions as if they were irreversible. And something we take really seriously at VXT is sweating irreversible decisions and thinking really thoughtfully about them. But when it comes to decisions which are reversible, we can turn around and walk back through that door, just trusting your intuition and not worrying too much, because if you're right, then that's great. And if you just kind of trust your gut and make the decision quickly, it's likely going to save you a lot of time and a lot of stress as well.
I think for some people as well, there's that there is a sort of inherent family pressure as well in some instances. I mean, I'm lucky in that regard. I didn't have that. My parents had their own businesses and worked for themselves, and they were very supportive and would be very supportive of whatever kind of career path I think that I would have chosen.
Not many people actually, I think, get to have that, or at least not everybody, and probably, some people really wish they did. Going back to that first job you had at Meredith Connell, you went through a number of roles relatively quickly, and now, of course, you're doing one job where you could be said to be doing a number of roles. You have so much variety. Do you think that was something you kind of always enjoyed, that variety, and maybe it was something you were looking for, or do you think it happened just more organically that you moved through those roles?
Yeah, I think I never once. I don't remember in my early years at MC ever kind of having a plan, and I think back now and think, God, what was I thinking? Because now I am a planner, and so, but clearly it worked out for me at the time, and so I did hold a few roles in the 8 years that I was there. I think that a lot of it was, I would say, a lot of it was organic in terms of opportunities as they arose. Kind of stuck my hand up. MC was a place that, and I don't know if it still is like this, but certainly in my time there, it was a place where you could put your hand up and get stuck into anything. There was no kind of this is your lane, this is my lane type approach. And I'm not saying that culture exists at Minters either, because it doesn't. But MC was unusually unique in terms of that. And so that enabled me, I think, to get some quite broad experience well outside of my role. When I think back to some of the things I did there, a lot of it actually didn't have anything to do with what I was doing, but enabled me to get a much broader understanding of how law firms function, both sort of operationally, but also just how to make a dollar too, and just the business of law, I guess. And I was lucky enough to be able to take that forward into my current role.
You mentioned that you had like a lot of opportunities to do different things there. I imagine you were involved in quite a few projects. Are there any significant ones that stand out to you?
Any significant ones? The biggest one that I was involved in was very much towards the end, and unfortunately I didn't see it through because this opportunity came up. But they were moving their practice management system across to a new platform, and for a law firm that's huge. It's everything from time recording and billing and client reporting and document management, and it drives the firm essentially. So that's quite a big project, and MC was the first country, I think globally, to purchase this full suite of product from Thomson Reuters. And so it was, I think, sort of 18 months, 2 years I was working on that before I left, and they've since gone live with it. So that was obviously quite a large project. Yeah, I think a lot of it was self-driving projects as well within the role that I had. So I worked quite closely about sort of 5 years plus in my time there with partners on around the digitisation project of all of the Crown prosecution files. So that involved working quite heavily with the police and the courts on just what that looked like in the courtroom and how the evidence was being collected and passed on to the Crown. So that role, when I think back on my time, that role was probably my favourite. It was extremely varied. I got to work with some fantastic people, really bright people, but also very funny and caring, and so that was definitely one of my more favourite roles that I had at MC.
So I'm really interested to double click on the practice management system project. Could you walk us through the decision-making process around, that led to the implementation of the new system at Meredith Connell? I'd be really interested to kind of, I guess, like break it down a little bit into assessment of the systems that are available and the needs that need to be addressed, and kind of the planning of the implementation, I suppose, and like how those differed, and like what those processes were like when it came to planning and implementation.
Yeah, so I wasn't heavily involved at the very beginning. I was involved more in sort of user groups at the beginning as opposed to kind of on the project team. That came a little bit later. But from a process perspective, we had a very old system at the time that was kind of being patched and dragged along by our chief information officer at the time, who did a great job of keeping it alive. But it's kind of a risky business, I guess, as well, having one person that can kind of just drag a system along. And it was also very old. And so it was obvious to the firm, I think, that an investment needed to be made. And because of the age of the system at the time, there was no automation, there was no kind of integration across systems, and so a lot of work was being done manually by people. And so that the impact of that in law firms is that often clients then get inconsistent documents, they get inconsistent material from us, and that's just not a good look. So there was a big upside to changing systems. And so once MC made the decision on a principled basis that, okay, we need to move to something, we don't know what, but we do, they pulled an RFP together and sent it out to the market. And then they invited the providers in, and this was when one of the processes that I was involved in, where they broke the system down, I think, into several parts. I can't remember how many, but there were quite a few. So, for example, it was sort of a time recording, a billing session, a client reporting session, and trust account session, and so on. So, and then they had people from across the firm who dealt in those areas in the room to for a bit of a product demo, and then we gave that feedback back to the chief executive at the time. She was running the project. So, and then ultimately a weighting exercise was applied. I'm guessing I wasn't involved in the decision on that, but they ultimately went with the 3E Elite product.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess maybe there are like similarities across the different projects you've worked on, during that time, but also since then. Like, how do you think about implementation of like a project, like bringing on a new practice management system, or equally moving to a new office? Like, what do you kind of sit down and do, and what are those things that you think about when you're looking to roll out?
I think the first thing before even any decision is made, and maybe even we just talk about premises as well, or look at it with a premises lens, because that's just what I'm doing at the moment. I think the first thing, just generally, project or no project, is just why are we doing this? I think understanding the why is actually super important, because you can't convey or convince the partnership who own the business that something needs to happen unless you're very clear on why this needs to happen in the first place. And so I think being very clear on the why and kind of the mission that we're trying to achieve here, I think that is the first thing. It's not the sell, it's just the mission. Why are we wanting to do this? Because actually there may not be much appetite for the why, in which case that's fine. The status quo is fine. But I think that's probably the first thing. And look, sometimes that's super obvious. Like in the case of premises, for example, we've been in our current building for 35 years. The fit out is getting on. The building served us extremely well, but there are potentially other opportunities in the market, and our lease was coming up to an end. So that kind of gave us an opportunity to just do a few market scans actually, and try and figure out what it was that we wanted to move to, or what we wanted to upgrade to if we wanted to stay. So I think the why, and that was drilled into me, I think, quite successfully, clearly, by the chief executive I used to work under at Meredith Connell, Kylie Mooney. And it's certainly something that's stuck, which is being very clear on the why and being able to communicate that quite clearly.
Yeah, and when you're confident about why a project is really important and the problem that it solves, how do you communicate that to the partnership and the broader law firm? Like, what do those responsibilities look like, and what is best practice?
Well, I often think that when you're dealing with partners in a law firm, it's all about influence without authority, because you can't really tell a business owner or group of business owners what they have to do. It's not about what they have to do. So I think one of the biggest things in a law firm is more about that influence ability, and the ability to build those strong relationships across the partnership, but also across the non-partnership cohort as well. So I think, talking from my experience, it's involving the partners very early on so that there's no sort of surprises that, hey, I've done all of these market scans on other buildings, for example, and I think this one's the best, so let's move here. That would not work. So you've really got to bring your partners along on the no surprises approach as if they were heavily involved in it, because they need to be. They're the ones paying for it. It's their brand, it's their business, and it's their sort of business's reputation, and so they need to be very heavily involved in that. And even if I think about kind of internal operational matters, quite often partners are very heavily involved in that, and it's quite critical that they're brought along on that as well. And we've got good forums here at Minters, I think, to share and disseminate information, but also to be able to bring a group of partners together and brainstorm and kind of think about something. So it's almost like there's no pride in the ownership of an idea in a law firm, in my view, where you kind of all just are in it together, but it's run very differently than a corporate where sort of one or two senior managers might have an idea about something and they take it to the board and it gets rubber stamped. Whereas in a law firm, I think there's this misconception that things happen much quicker in a law firm because you work with the business owners, you can get answers quicker. But I think it's the opposite. Because you work with the business owners, where actually you've got to socialize things, you've got to influence and bring people along. And so in some cases, it can actually take a lot longer to get things done in a law firm. And I actually really enjoy that. Yes, it's a drag sometimes, depending on what it is, but actually I do really enjoy it. I enjoy the challenge, the debate, and ultimately where we land can often be quite an innovative outcome.
Yeah. When you're working on these projects and there's like an unexpected obstacle or setback, post you've made these decisions, you're trying to implement the project, whether it's, a practice management system, you're setting up new users and going through training, and you've identified that, hey, look, what is actually a clear requirement wasn't discussed, wasn't thought about, and it looks like the new system doesn't meet that requirement. Or an office, there's this big delay, or part of the office that's causing a real problem, part of the fit out. How do you respond to an obstacle like that? How do you think about overcoming them?
I think, and this isn't necessarily, I know your question's sort of project-based, but my response is kind of more general than that. I think when anything doesn't quite work out to plan, whether it's a project like you've explained, or whether it's something that I've kind of said we should do this because I think this is better, or something like that, I think just not being too scared to say, guys, that was a flop. Not being apprehensive about just owning it and saying, look, we tried, my bad, sorry, and just go back. I think there can sometimes be, some people can be quite committed to the idea, and almost to the extent that it clearly is not going to work, but we just still have to push forward with it anyway. And sometimes there are reasons for that. But I think, where something clearly is not working and there is big pushback, and I've learned this in some cases the hard way myself, that you've just got to take your foot off the gas and say, we tried, it hasn't worked, I'm sorry, let's just go back. I don't see that as failure. I see that as, look, we gave it a good nudge, but actually this is causing people a lot of pain. And at the end of the day, as I said earlier, at the end of the day, we're all here to make our legal teams' lives easier, so ultimately our clients can get exceptional legal service. And if we're providing a barrier to that, then we're not doing justice to the firm. So I think for me, it's that honesty up front to say this hasn't worked.
Yeah, and I think that's a really common issue, because what you talked about there is really sunk cost fallacy, where people, you've been working on a project for some time in a particular direction, and so it feels really important. You've already spent all of this time, this money, these resources on this particular direction, and so changing now feels like you've lost something. You've lost all of those resources, and somehow they're a waste. But often, and I've found out the hard way in certain situations that sometimes you just kind of have to look at the situation you're in from the outside and not think about the history of your decisions, and then just, consider what is the best next step holistically. And that can really be a serious emotional problem to overcome in its own right as like a key decision maker in a project like that.
Yeah, look, I totally agree. And we touched earlier on influence in a law firm. And, I think if, lawyers are smart people, they know when something isn't working. You can't sit there and lie to them and say it is. So I think when that does happen, you risk losing that credibility. And when you've got no credibility in a law firm, it's very hard to get things done. It's very hard to work, it's very hard to work closely with the partners to influence outcomes when you don't have credibility. And so I think, in my experience at least, lawyers prefer that honesty and candidness up front early on. Say, look, guys, we gave it a nudge. Has it worked? Let's just go back. And that is absolutely something that I would stand by.
Today's episode is sponsored by VXT, the phone system built for law firms. VXT integrates with practice management systems so that when lawyers make calls, their billable time and legal advice can be saved in the right place automatically. 20% of billable time goes unrecorded. A lot of that is phone calls that get forgotten about. Get some of those billables back using VXT. Go to vxt.co.nz or click the link in the description to find out more.
So I actually wanted to know a bit more about how you landed in this role. So you had 8 years or so at Meredith Connell, and then now you've joined MinterEllisonRuddWatts as the operations manager. How was that a role you were looking for, or that found you?
I was looking for it. So after I was about 8 years at MC, and I was very open with our chief executive at the time that I was getting itchy feet, and I was quite keen to do more. And to her credit, she kept me on for probably 18 odd months longer than I had expected at the time, and the work was great, and I really, really enjoyed working at that firm, and think very fondly of my time there. But I knew that kind of 8 years in the same place while working on some fantastic things, I thought that I needed a new challenge and a fresh challenge, and this opportunity came up at Minter's for the operations manager role at the time, back in 2019, so the December of 2019, which was about 3 months before COVID. And so I started in the thick of our Auckland move into Commercial Bay. So the fit out was mostly complete by the time I started. So what I inherited was all of the kind of internal, getting rid of all our stuff, getting ourselves move ready, a lot of the change management. We were going from offices to open plan. So in some senses, it was easy for me because I didn't have to deal with part of the decision-making tree about whether we go open plan or not. That had already been made. So unlike our Wellington discussion where I was quite heavily involved in direction of travel there. So I started in December, and then of course we had COVID the following February, March, April. So that kind of distracted me a little bit as well when I still was effectively learning where the bathrooms were. So our fit out was mostly complete, but the building itself wasn't, and so we couldn't move into an incomplete building, and so that caused quite a bit of delay, which was proving challenging in terms of getting ourselves in the mindset of, okay, we're moving on X date, just because of the program slippage with history.
It sounds like you were somewhat kind of in the deep end when you joined. I mean, they were in the middle of a big project, and then COVID hit, and that would have all been quite a lot going on. What were those things that jumped out at you immediately that you just wanted to take action on as soon as you stepped into that role?
I'm quite a task-orientated person, and sometimes that's to my detriment, rather than just kind of taking things a lot slower. But I think when I first started, I remember sitting down at a meeting. It would have been my second day, if not my first day, and it was a meeting about the premises, a sort of weekly premises meeting with a bunch of other internal people that were assisting on the project. And I was sitting at the table along with the others, and we were kind of sitting in silence, and I was waiting for someone to start, and everyone was looking at me, and it kind of became obvious that people were waiting for me to start the meeting, and I was chairing it. And I thought, okay, I wasn't completely on the same page when I started about exactly what my role was going to be on the project. I knew I was going to be heavily involved, but I wasn't quite ready to literally be leading it and making decisions. But that, when I look back, that really was probably quite naive of me for not really figuring that out during the interview process. And look, I think when I think back about that whole process, I think that could have been an epic. That was quite risky on my part to take on this role, and it could have gone either way in terms of the move. So it could have been a complete flop and failure, and I would have had a very short time there, or it would have worked. And luckily, it was the latter, because we're talking right now. And look, there were a lot of people that contributed to that before I came along, so that's certainly not me taking the credit for that. It was, it was a very busy time and a very crazy time, but as I said earlier, I thrive in that kind of pressure, and I remember, much like most other businesses in the CBD at that time, where I think we were given 1 or 2 days notice that we were going into level 4, and so everyone went straight down to PB Tech and bought all sorts of stuff. And I remember at the time our chief financial officer and I trudged down Shortland Street and went into PB Tech and got printers and all sorts of things for people. And I think it's just about part of that is just not being precious about, and this is kind of just generally in a law firm, not being precious about your role and what you're doing on any particular day. I touched earlier on being told that the fridge is broken on a particular day. So, okay, no problem. I'll pass that on to the team and get the fridge fixed. And it was the same with COVID, where, you'd rock down the road and get a printer and a screen and a keyboard if that's what was needed to keep things moving. I remember putting, it was death by QR code around COVID. So there were QR codes around the office for, signing in and that kind of thing. So, I think it was a crazy time. But when I think back, it was very fun. It had the added challenge for me, of course, of not knowing anybody. And that was the hardest thing for me, because I'd come from a firm where I'd been there for so long and I knew everybody. And I knew, just by virtue of the different roles I had, I did touch on so many different parts of that firm. And I found that a real struggle, probably harder than I thought, actually, when I moved across and I didn't know anyone. I knew the people immediately around me that sat around me, but other than that, I knew nobody. And it's very tough in a law firm to get things done when you don't know anyone, and worse yet, when they don't know you.
Yeah, I can imagine some potentially confused people, hearing from Jordan while they're working from home in the first few days of the pandemic. Hey, I've got a printer.
Yeah, exactly. But on the flip side, it was a great way to get to know people too, right? Like it was a reason to get in front of people, much like the premises when I started. I remember holding a partner meeting sort of 2 or 3 weeks in, and everyone, a good chunk of them, wondering who I am. I think if there are reasons to get in front of people like I had at the time, that obviously helps. So there is a flip side to that.
Yeah. Thinking back to the first few days of the pandemic, how did you think about the most important things? The pandemic hits, the news drops, we're going into lockdown like tomorrow.
We were, and I don't want to, I don't think this is an arrogant thing to say, but I think we were very good at it. And I think a lot of businesses did get very good with it. I think the first time, maybe the second time, it was new. It was possibly a little bit exciting, notwithstanding the fact that it was actually a horrible situation that the economy was going into, that the country was going into, and that COVID, I'm not detracting from the fact that COVID has destroyed many lives, but it was a very different experience than what anyone had experience in. And so I think that, coupled with the fact that it was busy, meant that there was this little bit of kind of busy excitement. And so we were quite lucky. In some cases, there was a mad dash to do certain things to get us ready for lockdowns. But because if we weren't moving, I think it would have been a very different story. We'd rolled out new monitors, so we had a whole bunch of old monitors that people could take home. And so we were rolling out new laptops, so everyone had new laptops. We were given, you might remember, but we were given a bit of a heads up from the government that actually this the level 1, 2, 3, 4 system was coming in, and these are the rules around it, and I think we were given sort of 3 or 4 days heads up that we were going into level 4. And so a lot of businesses, and we were one of them, we did a trial working from home day or two, and it worked really well. We did have some issues around VPN licensing and things, but we were able to work through that very quickly. And so we were kind of set up quite well. And because we were going through the process of decluttering all our paper for the move, people were already quite comfortable with the idea that we don't need all this paper. In Wellington, obviously they had fewer lockdowns than Auckland, but there were some where they were in lockdown as well. With us in Auckland and Wellington, our Wellington office is already very sort of paper light. In their last move about 10 years ago, they had to move a couple of times in and out of the building while it was being refurbished. And through that process, they actually digitised a lot. And so they were already quite comfortable with that. I think busyness, was one thing. I think towards the end, and I think a lot of people would agree with this, it really kind of started to screw with you a little bit, because when we got put into lockdown, it started to get very short notice. It was sort of the night before, or I remember my wife was heavily pregnant with our first baby, and I realised a lot of people have had a rough experience with childbirth arrangements and things during COVID lockdowns. And luckily, we managed to avoid lockdowns when our baby was born in 2021. But last minute, I remember my wife's baby shower was meant to be on the Sunday, and on the Saturday night, quite late on Saturday night, Chris Hipkins came on TV and locked us all down, and so all of this food was in our house ready for this baby shower the next day, and it was just chaos. So and there was another occasion where all of our partners were on a conference in Queenstown. And they were put into lockdown that Saturday night, and it was quite late again, and they'd all had quite a few drinks, as you would expect, as had I. I was sitting at home on a Saturday night and having to deal with that, where a bunch of partners, like, you can be stuck in worse places, right? So I can't say I felt sorry for them instantly. But there was quite a lot of logistical issues around getting some people back and communicating with staff on a Saturday night, particularly with the partners. So there were all of these kind of things, and personally, it was quite difficult. So I said we were expecting our first, and as I said, we were lucky to avoid lockdowns with the hospital birth. I know not everyone was that fortunate. I was very lucky, and I do think I was lucky, because I got to spend, so 2021 being that very long Auckland lockdown, sort of 3 odd months, I got to work from home and spend all that time with our newborn, and that's time that I would never have had with him otherwise. And we've since had a second baby, and by comparison, I haven't had that time with her, because on the one hand, I really cherish that. I know my wife went absolutely crazy, not being able to go out and do all of the exciting things that new mothers want to do with newborns. So she missed out, and I feel for her on that. She's a trooper, and so she did a fantastic job during COVID. And then one of the lockdowns, I was diagnosed as being a type 1 diabetic, and that kind of came out of complete left field. I'd always been in quite good health, and I had always kind of had this misconception about what diabetes was, and so I've kind of had to learn a lot since 2021, so now being sort of fully insulin dependent, so having to deal with that and come up to speed with that, and managing, or being part of our COVID response management and things all from home, and it was a very full-on time.
Wow. Is that like a condition that you had your whole life but had gone undiagnosed, or is it something that developed?
I'm told it's something that developed, which is a little bit rare in terms of it developing in my age. I mean, I'm 31. A lot of people get diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in childhood. So it did come as a shock. And so I was just feeling unwell for probably sort of 3 or 4 weeks, and did what probably everybody does and Google your symptoms, because they were a little bit unusual. Some of the symptoms, the main one being you're just constantly thirsty. You've just got a dry mouth constantly, regardless of how much water you drink. And so that's kind of the leading symptom, it turns out. So trudged along to the doctors, did some tests, and it was that 2021 famous lockdown. So it was on that day that I was told that I'm a type 1 diabetic.
Wow. What kind of effects did that have on your your life and your work and everything?
A lot more than I was expecting, to be honest. I said earlier that I'd always been someone in good health. I'm certainly not. I'm certainly no bodybuilder, but I'm also someone that has never needed to go to the doctors. I've had an appendix out. That's it. So I've always been in relatively good health, and so and this has changed that, right? So I have to count and calculate how many carbohydrates I'm eating, and do a bit of a calculation to figure out how much insulin I need every time I eat. And there's this misconception that you can't have sugar. That's not actually the case. For me, every type 1, so type 1 diabetes is there are some variations to it. So not every type 1 diabetic is the same. It was quite a learning curve. Remembering to give yourself medication when you eat, that was a novel concept to me, and remembering to take, administer medication. And I've never kind of been the type of person that's kind of scared of needles, but obviously injecting yourself multiple times a day now, that's quite a new thing. So there are a lot of advancements with technology around diabetes management, and I'm lucky enough to be able to have a sensor that sits in my arm that pings off to my phone that tells me what my blood sugar is doing, so I can address that quite easily. So yeah, it's been a learning curve.
That's so cool. The sensor in particular, I love technology, as is probably very obvious. There was news recently about the new Apple Watch and how it will be able to measure your blood sugar and do other things without being invasive whatsoever. So it's some kind of new sensor technology where you can literally wear a watch and you measure a variety of important vitals that are crucial for understanding when you have conditions like type 1 diabetes. So not to turn this into an Apple advert, though.
No, look, I was very well supported by family, and even at Minters, so one of our partners at the time, she's since left. She's a type 1 diabetic, and so I was able to talk to her about things. She had it for most of her life, so she had obviously a lot more experience with it. So yeah, it was one of those things that you just kind of come up to speed with and learn. The timing was a little bit unhelpful, but sometimes these things are, and you just got to deal with it.
Yeah, connecting, especially in the early days, connecting with other people that are in your situation is so important, isn't it?
Yeah, no, definitely, yeah.
So volunteering can be a really great way of supporting kind of community organizations while also facing problems and developing your own skills. I volunteered a bunch while I was studying. I got a lot of value out of it, and was able to support some local communities in Christchurch, which was a really something I really enjoyed doing. You volunteered at Lifeline Aotearoa for a few years. Could you explain what Lifeline is, how you were involved with it, and what motivated you?
Yeah, so Lifeline is a fantastic organisation that is self-funded in terms of donations and things. They get no government funding at all. And they are a helpline and a text line service for people who want to talk. So I was a helpline counsellor volunteer there for just over 2 years, I think. I'd been looking for something to get involved in for a little while at this time. I wanted to do something hands-on. And I wanted to do something that contributed to the community in some form, obviously, because that's why you do it. But I also wanted to get something out of it myself. And by that, I mean, I wanted to learn something new. I didn't want necessarily to do something that I thought would be very easy, and something that I thought that I could do, easily enough. I wanted to be challenged on it, and particularly at that point in time, and I'm certainly not saying that that's changed now, but particularly at that point of time, I wasn't very good at talking and thinking on my feet and being able to help in the moment with things. Just in my work life, I would often be that person that couldn't really sit at a table and contribute actively. I would want to kind of go away and quietly ponder and then come back. And I think a lot of that's changed now. but that was part of the drive for getting into Lifeline on the one hand. The other hand was my mum was very heavily involved with Lifeline back in the early 90s. And she worked for organisations like Victim Support and other organisations like that, volunteered for them. So, and she passed away in, when was that? 2015. And so I was very keen to do something that I thought my mother would be supportive of, and something that I felt I could tie back to that and have that connection. And so Lifeline, there was an ad actually, ironically, just came up on TV one night, and I thought, that is quite unique timing, and I thought maybe I could give that a crack. And so I applied online, and then I got the call up about a month later for an interview, went along, and they said, yes, we'd love to have you. They were doing an intake at the time of new volunteers. And then you go through quite intense training. It's actually very confronting training, and very emotionally heavy training, a lot more than what I was expecting. And, to have, there were only 2 women in my group of 40 intakes, and that was the first time they said that there was such a heavy male group, and I think that that's just fantastic. And I remember in the training session, a lot of these men were they had their own personal experiences with suicide and other things within the direct family, and that was their call to action for Lifeline. And I remember a lot of the sessions being very confronting around that, very heavy, and something that you could kind of all gather around each other and work on. So the training was sort of 6 to 8 weeks long. It was Saturdays and Sundays for that whole time, I think, from memory. And then you get buddied up with somebody, and you have your training wheels on for quite a long time. It's not just a matter of kind of letting you loose on the phones. And then you get a lot of support. And I absolutely loved it. And I think there's a bit of a misconception with Lifeline that you're talking to somebody who is contemplating ending their life in that moment, but it's not like that. I mean, absolutely, there are those crisis calls, but a lot of the time you're talking to people that are very lonely, that actually just want somebody to talk to. Sometimes people have problems that, specific problems that they want to talk about. Others just want to chat. It might be an elderly lady who's got no family that just wants to talk for 40 minutes, and so you do that. And so it was such a rewarding experience. And I think back on it, and it was probably one of the most humbling experiences. There's something quite privileged about being in that position where you're picking up the phone and talking to somebody, and they're just opening up to you, and you've never met them. You don't even know their name a lot of the time. And it's a very high trust environment. And part of what that taught me, both personally but also professionally, was that you don't need to solve the problem. And I touched earlier on always being a task-orientated person, sometimes to my detriment. And this is one of those instances where actually they don't want to be told to go to their GP if they're feeling unwell, or go and see a counsellor, or they're not thinking about that. A lot of the time, they're not thinking beyond the 4 walls of their bedroom or their house because life is just too difficult. So that was a very heavy part of the training around actually you're not here to solve problems. A lot of the people that you're talking to don't want that. They want someone to talk to. They want someone to vent to. And sure, there might be an occasion on those calls where you can test with them the extent to which they're wanting to solve things and get help and so on. But a lot of the time they didn't.
Yeah, I think I've often learned that lesson the hard way as well when my friends, have been talking to me, and I'm also task oriented, and so oftentimes I think we can too quickly jump to trying to help people and give that in a sense of giving them advice and direction, and in a lot of cases, the more appropriate thing to do is just like hear someone speak and tell them that you're listening, I guess. So you're on the board as well of Waitematā Community Law.
Yes.
How did you get involved in working in the community law space?
Yeah, so I'd finished up at Lifeline after a little bit, and that was largely around work commitments. So and COVID. They needed to be the supervisor on the call floor, basically, that was there to help, and they were a qualified counsellor or psychologist. It wasn't an environment where ironically, demand on their services were at an all-time high, but being in lockdown, volunteers couldn't go. It wasn't deemed an essential service, and so volunteers couldn't go out and do it, and they weren't equipped, both financially and also operationally, they weren't equipped to have all these volunteers scattered around the country working from home to do this. And so through COVID and just my own workload meant that I needed to step back after a couple of years, and the birth of our child at the same time. So it was a busy time. So unfortunately I had to step back. And then after a few years, I wanted to do something again, and I wasn't sure what. I thought I wanted to get into sort of the more governance end of an organisation or a not-for-profit, but I didn't really have any natural affinity with something. I don't play sports, so sitting on the board of a sports club or something like that just didn't make sense. I didn't have and don't have children at sort of school, so sitting on the school board of trustees just isn't a natural fit either. And so I was kind of just waiting really for something to crop up. I wasn't actively looking. And then a board member position came up for Waitematā Community Law, which I just happened to see on Seek. And I thought, I think I could do this. I've got a lot of transferable skills working in the legal industry, so I kind of understand the regulatory framework that lawyers operate in. I've got community experience with Lifeline, and so I thought I could give it a go. And so I applied and met the chairperson and treasurer at the time and was invited to join the board. And then shortly after that, they were looking for a deputy chairperson, and they asked if I would be interested, and I said I was. And so that's kind of what led to that.
What are the key initiatives and projects that community law are currently involved in? And also, what are the ways that our listeners can get involved and support the local community law centres as well?
Yeah, so community law is a free legal service for those people with unmet legal needs. So generally people who can't afford legal advice, which is often a barrier for people. It's not it's not in addition to legal aid. So this is mostly about legal advice as opposed to legal representation. And so we have clinics and walk-ins that people from our community can walk in, see a lawyer, get some advice about whether it's an employment matter, a tenancy matter, an immigration matter. It's a broad range of anything and everything. And so the lawyers at our law centre, and actually every law centre across the country, are true champions, I think, at being able to know such a broad range of law. An employment query could come in today, and then tomorrow will be an immigration matter. And so they really have to do, they do a great job of clearing and triaging a lot of these issues. And a lot of the issues that come in the door they might not actually start off as a legal issue. It might start off as more of a social issue. And through the discussion with the client, it's very clear that there's actually an underlying legal issue that needs to be addressed as well. And so our motto at community law at Waitematā is that no one leaves with nothing. And even if it's not a legal matter, we might refer to another agency. If there's a budgeting issue, for example, we might refer them to a budgeting service, just as an example. So I think the way others can get involved in, so Minters is a proud pro bono provider of community law, Waitematā, and just a coincidence. and I know, Luke, you've got some involvement with Waitematā law as well, so thank you. And so I think the way people can get involved, obviously being a legal service, if you're a lawyer, volunteering is the main way people can get involved. We couldn't survive without our volunteers in particular. So we've got arrangements with Chapman Tripp, Balgally and Minters. They all send volunteers out every week. And we've got a team of sort of 6 or 7 lawyers from memory, and they're of varying levels. Some aren't admitted yet, some aren't. So what they do is, they take their walk-ins. They're heavily involved in law reform and community working groups with sort of the likes of the police and the judiciary.
Awesome. Well, to finish things up, I've just got a wee quick fire round
Sure.
To throw you through, Jordan. So what I'd love to do is I'm going to ask you a few quick questions here, and I want you to tell me kind of the first thing that comes to mind, just like maybe a sentence or two, really. So first up, what do others not know that you know to be true?
I think that everyone is always motivated. It's just those motivations can be quite different.
What do people not understand about law or law firms that you wish they did?
That it's just like every other workplace. It's not suits.
What single element would you want to change about the legal industry today?
Probably the accessibility for our community.
What's the most painful lesson you've learned that you're pleased to have learned?
To slow down and not rush into things, and take the time to listen and bring people along with you.
Finally, what's the nicest thing anyone has ever done for you?
I actually think it's not so much a single act, but I think my wife is one of the most caring people that I think I've ever come across, and I think that having her support in my career and what she sometimes has to put up with, I think, is one of the sort of a big act of care.
That's so wholesome. I love it. Thanks so much for taking the time to catch up with us, Jordan. I really appreciate it, and it was an awesome conversation. How can people reach out to you if they're interested in connecting?
So I'm on LinkedIn if people want to do that. Yeah, otherwise there's my website profile on the Minter Ellison website.
Fantastic. Well, we'll put links to MinterEllisonRuddWatts, Jordan's profile on LinkedIn, as well as how you can reach out to Lifeline, Aotearoa, and Waitematā Community Law as well to support them too. Thanks so much, mate.
No, thank you. Cheers, guys. Thanks, Ella, Luke.